We're starting Chapter 12, which is about sample surveys. So Chapter 12 will have 3 videos, and throughout those 3 videos, we're going to talk about 3 main ideas. The first main idea is that we're going to examine a part of the whole. So what that means is that we're going to draw a sample. So if we want to know how the whole population is thinking, we need to know how to go about doing that. So the population is the overall that we're interested in. Am I interested in how my class feels about using M&Ms? Or am I interested in how the whole school feels about uniforms? Or how the state feels about increasing gas prices? Or how the entire country feels about Donald Trump running for president? That can be your population, the overall. The issue is that it is often improbable or impossible to ask everybody individually. If our population is the whole country, there's no way that we're going to be able to talk to every single person in the country. So what we have to do is we have to examine a small group, which is called a sample. And then we can use that sample to decide how the population is thinking. And I know it seems like we shouldn't be able to do that, but statistically it works out. So, for example, if you are making soup, or your mom is making soup, when you make soup, you put all of the ingredients in a pot, and you let it cook until the flavors all come together and taste good. When you decide to taste your soup, to see if it tastes good or if it needs more salt, you don't have to eat the whole pot of soup to figure out if it tastes good. You can stir it around, dip your spoon in, take a bite, and determine, does this taste good? If it does, then you're done cooking. Or maybe we have to add something. But that's what a sample does. You can sample something to determine if it's good or not. So we can sample a population and determine how the whole population feels. So continuing to talk about sample surveys, opinion polls are a good example of taking a sample from the whole population. These polls are examples of sample surveys. Sample surveys are designed to ask questions to a small group of people in hope of learning about the population as a whole. So really what we're going to be doing in Chapter 12 is discussing different ways that we can create and collect data for sample surveys. But our main focus today is going to end up to be talking about sampling error and bias, which leads to bias and error. Sampling error, which is also known as sampling variation, describes natural variability in results that you will see from one sample to the next. You expect there to be variation. If I were to measure the average height of my first hour class, it is not going to be exactly the same as the average height of my second hour class. We expect there to be differences. Those differences are called error. I know normally error is supposed to be a bad thing, but in this case, we expect to have it. So error is going to be found in every sample. Bias, on the other hand, is something about the design of the survey that distorts the result so that they are unlikely to reflect reality. Bias is what is actually bad. So polls or surveys often fail because they are using a sampling method that tends to over or underrepresent parts of the population. So for example, they may survey more rich than poor, more white than Latino, more old than young, and that affects your results so that it doesn't actually represent your entire population. So continuing to talk about bias, sampling methods that over or under-emphasize some characteristics of the population are said to be biased. Bias is the one thing above all else that you want to avoid. If biased in any way, your data is useless and nothing out of it can be used or salvaged. So if you have bias, you have to throw away your entire study and start over. So again, you want to avoid bias. So how do we ensure that our surveys are not biased? Well, I've heard from many of you, Bryant, you asked this on Friday, what is the point of random numbers? When you use random numbers and you randomize, we end up avoiding bias. To avoid bias, we have to randomize our sample. There are different types of bias. So the first type is undercoverage. So what undercoverage is that it gives part of the population less representation than it actually has. So if your population is half females, but your sample only covers 25% of females, then your sample is going to be biased because females are underrepresented. Then there is non-response bias. So non-response bias is when a large fraction of those sampled fails to respond. Typically, those who do respond are likely to not represent the entire population. A type of non-response is voluntary response. This is when the sample is self-selected. People with strong opinions are more likely to want to participate. Voluntary response can be seen if you have to fill out a questionnaire and mail it back in, because the only way that you're responding is if you take the time, fill it out, and mail it back in. Typically, the only people who do that are people who have a very strong opinion, one way or the other. So you're leaving out the people in the middle altogether. So that's one of the reasons why voluntary response is an issue. Response bias is another type. So anything in a survey design that influences responses, so the wording or the type of question asked, can be a form of response bias. So wording bias in particular is the way that the question is worded can influence the results. So instead of asking, what did you think of the movie, you might say, how did you like the movie? Because now you're indicating that you liked the movie. And that word is going to affect the way that you're going to respond. The type of question, it might be a question that by answering this question, you get something for it. So maybe you are told that by answering the following questions, you get a free cruise. That's going to be a form of response bias because now the only reason why you're responding is because you're getting a free cruise out of the deal. Selection bias is another type of bias, and this is where the sample is chosen because it was easy to obtain. It's just convenient. This leads us to the convenient sample, which is a form of selection bias, and it consists of individuals who are conveniently available. So, for example, if I wanted to know how the school felt about the dress code, and I only asked my first hour because that was convenient, I am only asking seniors and one sophomore. So sophomores, freshmen, and juniors are all going to be underrepresented because I asked you guys just because it was convenient. So that doesn't work. So those are all the type of bias. But how you want to think about biases is that you want to look for biases in any survey you encounter before you collect the data. Because if you wait until after the data is collected, you've done a lot of work for no reason. There's no way to recover from a biased sample. You would have to start all over. So spend your time and resources reducing biases. You want to make sure that you do not have bias in your data. If you possibly can, you want to pilot test your survey first, because sometimes things might not pop up until you do start collecting the data. So if you were to pilot test it first, you might then realize, oh wait, this is forming this kind of a bias. We need to change it. And then you can determine how you need to change it. And then you want to always report your sampling methods in detail. So make sure you are explaining everything you are doing thoroughly. That is it for today. Tomorrow we will talk more about randomization. And then we will end up talking more about sampling methods after that. But that's it for tonight. So I will see you guys tomorrow.